Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, the first of our panel sessions at the conference over the next couple of days. I'm Ed Humpherson. I'm the head of the Office for Statistics Regulation here in the United Kingdom, and I've got a fantastic panel with me to talk about the question of beyond GDP, which I'm going to introduce them in a second. But firstly, if you are like me and you've been really studiously reading your brochure and trying to work out which of the many sessions you want to go to and trying to work out if you can clone yourself because there's too many sessions running in parallel that you want to be at both of them, you might have noticed a pattern. So at 4:15 this afternoon, there's contributed session E, Inclusive Wealth Beyond GDP. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock, there's a plenary session, GDP B, a new framework for measuring the economy. And on Friday, not only do we have at 10:45 a contributed session J, Inclusive Wealth Beyond GDP, we also have a third plenary session, How Can Climate Be Taken into Account in National Accounts, a proposal to augment national accounts. I think we can conclude from that this question of whether GDP is doing what we need it to do in measuring the economy is live, it's active, and it's attracting a lot of interest from people who care about economic measurement. And that's what this panel is here to explore and discuss. And in a sense, frame these issues at a meta level, which you can then take forward into those following sessions that I've just outlined. Now, I'm not going to set out the issues. We have 3 speakers to do that. But before I introduce them, I'd like to find out something from all of you in the audience. I'm going to ask you to let us know your view via a very sophisticated survey mechanism known as raising your hands. So I'm going to offer you 2 options, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand as the option which you think is right. So the first option is that you think that GDP has had its day. It's a fundamentally 20th century technology that's an artifact of the post-war consensus, and it's now hopelessly inadequate to measure the contemporary economy. And the second option is GDP remains the best way of measuring economic progress, and sensible tweaks, sensible changes will be sufficient to maintain its relevance. So on a show of hands, how many of you think that GDP has had its day? Thank you. And a second show of hands, how many of you think that GDP is the best way with a few tweaks? Well, I think very clearly the few tweaks perception wins out. And if there's a more trustworthy, high quality, high value way of collecting data, I'm yet to see it. So thank you very much for that. I'm now going to introduce our speakers. We're going to hear from 3 speakers in turn, starting with Richard Hayes, who is the acting chief economist at the ONS, a stalwart of ESCoE, I should say. And I always think that if ONS are doing something innovative in economic measurement, you can be almost sure that Richard is behind it. So we're going to hear from Richard first. Then we're going to hear from Dame Diane Coyle, who's the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, very extensive commentator and writer about these questions, has written a fantastic history of GDP, a brief but affectionate history, and has just published The Measure of Progress, which is about contemporary measurement and extremely pertinent to this discussion. And then thirdly, Chris Giles, who is the FT's economic commentator, a visiting professor at UCL, University College London, the other place, I think we can call it when we're here at KCL, deeply insightful on the challenges of measuring the economy. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard for your reflections, and then Dan will pick up, and then Chris, and then we'll have a good Q&A. Thank you. Richard.
For a dangerous moment there, being the production side of UKSA, I thought Ed was going to ask me to count up the hands. But so, does the UK need a broader measure of success? I'm going to argue it does, but I'm going to argue that it doesn't mean that we need to discount GDP, because I think there are some particular tasks that different measures can perform. And I think much of the policy debate that we see around this is about the degree of sophistication that users want to get into to be able to tackle the types of issue that they are grappling with. I think this is a really important moment in time to be coming back to this question, because obviously we are at a point where we have just had the UN sign off the new system of national accounts, and that obviously tried to answer some of this question in its major work strands: digitalization, globalization, and well-being and sustainability. And I think when we stand back and we look at where we've got to through that process, we see that the S&A took really big steps in a particular direction for a particular set of users, who were predominantly the traditional economics users, not necessarily those who were interested in this well-being agenda. And in some ways, I think people find this quite puzzling, because we obviously had Stiglitz-Sen-Fatoussi, we've had a lot of work over the same time period as the last S&A revision cycle. And so the question of why this gap emerged, I think, is very important. And I think, in part, is because they were attempting to deliver rather different things. You look at Stiglitz-Sen-Fatoussi, the OECD's Better Life work, you see dashboard approaches, you see multiple methods, multiple measures being deployed. You don't see the type of integrated framework which the S&A attempts to deliver for the economic space. And the S&A, whilst it has new chapters on well-being and sustainability, didn't really attempt to break into that integrated framework type space. And I think in some ways that is the key question. Is there an approach which is going to work well here and which serves different needs? I think, I quite often stand back, and we debate this quite a lot. You look at GDP, it has some profound limitations if you want to use it for certain things. I think there is a very important question there about whether you should use it for some of those things, and that's an age-old debate. But one thing you can use it for is effectively to give you a measure of the resources available to a country and or a government. And so in some ways, as economists, we can think about it as giving us the supply side, the story about resources that we have available for use. It doesn't necessarily have great strength in a world where we're thinking about far wider issues, about telling us about the demand side, about where we should spend those resources. Is it the environment? Is it on increasing output? And that question of how we bring together those two perspectives, GDP, I think, gives us strength on one side of that equation, and we need to find complements and data on the other side. So at the ONS, I think we've been tackling both efforts to define and create dashboards, but also to try and create integrated economic style measures which go beyond GDP. And for those of you who were in the Beyond GDP session immediately before this one, you'll have seen Cleena Taylor presenting on our work in that space. In terms of dashboards, I think the key thing that we have learned is that complexity doesn't necessarily help users a great degree. And we found this in the run-up to the general election last year. We had a 60-measure dashboard, about 30 measures we could measure on a timely basis, and about 30 measures we couldn't. They needed a longer time lag. And in the run-up to the general election, the 30 timely measures were all saying broadly flat or negative things. And looking at what was in the basket of the 30 slower measures, we could see things that were going to likely improve. So to be able to work out, even within that presentation, what message we could give people was very, very complex. So we've decided to simplify that model to go for only timelier measures in the quarterly series. And I think that will help us to move the discussion forward, alongside trying to get the integrated measures, the inclusive income and wealth produced on a faster, more timely basis, using some of our new nowcasting capability. But whatever we do in that space, I think it's still as a complement to GDP, which still has a core part in helping us to understand that supply side of this equation. So I will pause there and we can pass on.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's a tremendous introduction to the issues. Let's pass on to Diane.
Ed, I want to introduce you to the concept of sample selection bias. You've got a room full of GDP producers. Yeah. So my book 10 years ago was called GDP, A Brief but Affectionate History, and I guess I've got less affectionate over the intervening decade. I think there'll always be a need for a nominal GDP measure of some kind for fiscal policy and monetary policy, but I think it fails in two ways. One is the way that Richard's just been talking about. How do we give people, voters, policymakers, a sense of whether people's lives are getting better or not? And I like the initiative at Earnest to look at inclusive wealth, comprehensive wealth, and the net measures there. That's got a really solid foundation in economic theory. It uses a lot of the statistics that are already collected for GDP, but it introduces a wider range of assets. It introduces concepts of sustainability, and you can think about applying different valuation methods to take you towards different welfare constructs. And so it's a very flexible but consistent with economic theory approach to doing that measure of progress. But I thought what I'd talk a little bit more about now was the second way GDP fails, and it fails on its own terms because it's not capturing a lot of the structural changes in the production side of the economy that have been taking place over the past 20 years. The book has a chapter on each of these, but just to list them, one is about new production models. So rather than the traditional integrated manufacturer, looking at factoryless goods producers, looking at global supply chains and where value added is created in a timely way and at the level of the supply chains themselves, not the sectoral level. Looking at all of the unpaid production that's taking activity out of the market sector into what's called the household sector, but a lot of it is very directly economically valuable activity, such as open source software, user innovation or open innovation, production of data. Data as labour is the concept used in the literature, but also all of the things that we do for ourselves now using digital technologies that used to be in the market sector. My favourite example is those terrible automatic checkout machines in supermarkets, which have added some hardware and software, but basically substituted our unpaid labour for the paid labour in the store. It's going to do wonders for their productivity measures, but actually it's not clear that it's really a productivity gain. There are gaps in measuring the use of the cloud and cloud infrastructure, how much data is flowing, what's being paid for it, what infrastructure is there, how do we think about valuing that. Gaps around intangibles, including, importantly, data. The AI transformation is fueled by data, so how do we conceptualize and value that? New modes of working, hybrid working, the adoption of digital tools, who actually is using different forms of AI and what are they doing with it? So all of these kinds of changes that are going on in the economy that are just not captured, either because the data isn't being recorded for a range of reasons, including the fact that these very large, powerful tech companies don't want to hand over any data that would help do it, but also some of the concepts involved. And one of the examples that I've often give is some work I did with Richard and other colleagues looking at the price of telecommunications services. And we constructed an index that took better account of the range of services that we buy on use on our smartphones these days. And that was fed through into the industry data and the double deflated GDP data by ONS. But there's still an issue there about what is the right way to conceptualize the price of a bundle of services that go together. Because what creates the value for us as consumers isn't just the bytes of data that get transferred over the telecoms networks. It's the content that's being provided there. And I don't think we've got a good way of thinking about some of those price issues. So I don't have a lot of easy solutions for these. In fact, I'm hoping to set up a career's worth of activity for all the young researchers in ESCoE. But I think there's a really large agenda in understanding the supply side, production side structure of the digital economy much better. It's changing really quickly still. There are lots of fantastic research efforts, some of them done by people I can see here in the audience today. But the question is how to solidify the concepts, gain consensus around those, and get them into statistical production. And there's a really big agenda there for GDP to work even on its own terms. I guess my final comment would be, it's not great that the UN has adopted SNA 2025, which made some modest changes, and then the Secretary-General immediately said, but that doesn't tell us what we need to know, and has set up another expert panel to have a look at how do we go beyond GDP. It's not really a very satisfactory position. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's tremendous. We'll just hand straight over to Chris to pick up from there. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Ed. And I feel I'm maybe going into the lion's den because I'm going to disagree with Diane, and to do that when she's written two very learned and good books on the subject will probably put me into a difficult position a little bit later in this panel. I've got no particularly strong views on the details of the production or on SNA, and I do think, and I think this is what my main point will be, that quite often we particularly in the statistical community, slightly are rooting around in the trees and we lose sight of the bigger picture. So I suppose I'll start from the very famous Robert Kennedy's 1968 speech where he said GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. I hate that speech. I hate it with an absolute passion, partly because it is an utter cliche. It's in every news article which starts on GDP, and then they use that and then they segue immediately into whatever they like, whatever the author of the piece really values is what should be in GDP, and it can be different. So you'll find at the moment, particularly on the left of politics, you'll find environment and climate is what should be in GDP, but isn't. But it's not just an issue on the right, on the left. Elements of particularly the US right and some parts of the very traditional US right are furious that women's work, paid work in the labour market is in GDP, because what they really want is women to be staying at home in the kitchen still. And so there's quite a big debate there that GDP is forcing people into the labour market and meaning that the traditional family, which is what they value, no longer exists. When we look at some of the attempts to go beyond GDP and add measures, I'm going to just look at the ONS's inclusive measures. When you look at the results of them, some of the results you get are frankly just a little bit odd. I mean, I take Diane's point there. I don't no way saying that the ONS has made any conceptual, theoretical or practical errors in this. But we think about the 2010s, the austerity period, low GDP growth, real and nominal, and we look at then, for example, net inclusive income, a wider measure. It rises almost twice as fast in the 2010s as the measure. But I think most people's prior would be actually something was going wrong in that decade, and GDP was in some sense, you saw the government sort of claiming the GDP figures, and the people say, well, it wasn't as good as that. But you look at the net inclusive income measure, and that was doing rather better. There's no complaint, it just shows how difficult it is. And what you have to do is you have to weight these other things you want to put in on the same measure as money that you put in GDP. And I think the beauty of GDP, at least conceptually, is it is a measure of the monetary value of goods and services produced. It's really important for both what society can afford is exactly what Ed was saying at the start. It's the supply side, and particularly what governments can afford. And then society can have an argument and a good debate about what to do about it. And society is very good at that. I mean, we look at, society gets very, very excited about topics that are far from GDP. The migration debate, the environment, all these things are fundamentally part of democracy. And it doesn't matter that GDP is what it is. It doesn't stop society having other debates and talking about other things. And this is where I particularly disagree with you start with the Robert Kennedy thing, and then you say, well, it doesn't, because it's not measured, it's not important. And that's, I just think, fundamentally wrong. And just if you were a Martian coming down to the UK, let's say, and you were presented with the real GDP growth figures annual for the last 70 years, just the growth numbers, and you saw them bouncing around, going up 2.25%, 2.5% on average until 2008, 2009, and then much lower thereafter, and then COVID, big drop. I think you'd have a pretty good idea about what society was like and what we were moaning about. I don't think you'd have got entirely the wrong end of the stick. And certainly when you look at cross-country measures, GDP correlates about 0.9 with the UN's Human Development Index. It correlates with about the same number with infant mortality, life expectancy, and well-being indicators. So I'll just finish on a rather flippant point. If you're alive, if your kids are alive, and if you're reasonably happy, you can thank GDP.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you to all three of you. It makes chairing really simple and really a joy, because normally when you chair a panel like this, your panellists always fall over themselves and each other to agree. I agree with that point that the other person has made. Here we have three panellists who I think have staked out very distinct positions, which I think help, and very respectfully and politely, but distinct positions. And I think that helps flesh out the architecture of the debate. Because you've staked out different positions, I'm going to ask each of you if you have any comments on what you've heard your colleagues say. So, Richard, is there anything that you'd like to pick out from Diane and Chris just to respond to or react to?
I think I'll just pick up the point Chris raised about why net inclusive income looks so different. And I think it does tell us something, which is this is a period in time where we were doing something different in terms of attempts to reduce environmental damage. And where we've attempted to capture changes in carbon emissions and environmental degradation, atmospheric degradation, and try to put a value on that. And I think we'd all say, yeah, you've got to go look at that, think about the caveats, think about the valuation methodologies. But if you begin to value that, even in fairly conservative ways, you look at a period where we've transitioned from coal to having no coal fuel power stations, big changes in the technology, big changes in the quantity of energy being used and the ratios of energy to carbon. And what it gives you is a way of beginning to understand and think about that debate in terms of what effectively you've given up. I mean, I characterize it to people that the UK has an innovation budget. It can use its innovation budget to increase output, or it can use it to reduce pollution. And in changing that decision, we're now able to look at and quantify, was that a good idea? Was the secret sauce as effective in reducing the secret source of productivity growth, innovation? Was it as effective in reducing pollution as we used to see it in increasing output? And where the lines are a lot more, they're not quite the same, but you're almost back up at a pre-2008 growth rate. It suggests that actually we didn't do all that badly on reducing atmospheric degradation. Was that the right decision? I'll leave that to other people, but at least we're in a position where now we can have a better debate about it. And I think that in many ways is what the statistics we produce is for. It's to make sure we empower those debates and get to a position where policymakers can see with greater clarity what those big trade-offs are that they're making.
Excellent. Diane.
So I'll respond to Chris as well. Chris, thank you very much. I suppose I think it depends what you think the purpose of the statistics is. And we're at a time of great need to respond to climate and biodiversity challenges, so a need for a big transition in the structure of production and consumption as a result of that. And a time when, for reasons of security and long-term supply side capacity in the economy, the government's thinking about industrial policy. So I'm going to concentrate on the bit of my argument was that about GDP not doing very well in its own terms, because it's the statistics to enable the government to make those kinds of decisions are really hard to put together. I'm on the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council. The government has target sectors, so it's creative industries, AI and tech, advanced manufacturing, defence. They don't, even those don't fall naturally out of the categorizations that we have in the national statistics. So even at the level of classification, they're not very helpful. So I'm calling partly to think about inclusive wealth and those kinds of measures for reasons of the need to make an energy and biodiversity transition, but also for just better statistics and approaches to the supply side of the economy given the technological revolutions.
So does that mean, Diane, that you would repurpose the Robert Kennedy quote from "it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile" to "it measures everything except that which we do in our current economic activity"?
I hate the Robert Kennedy quote too.
Okay.
Total cliche.
I think my simple response would be, particularly to Diane, would be that you asserted that we needed to make environmental and biodiversity transitions. Quite a lot of people in society don't agree, and particularly in this country more people agree with you, but if you went to the US you would find a very large, perhaps a majority of people would disagree. I happen to agree with you, but and I think this is where it gets really difficult. The moment you start putting these things into GDP and you turn it from being a relatively, in that sense, uncontentious, I know there's lots of imputed stuff in there already, but a relatively uncontentious attempt to do the monetary value of what's produced, I think you get into all sorts of trouble. And we're going to have these arguments about biodiversity and the environment and climate and local environment and global environment are different topics, and people can sit on different sides of the fences there. I just think GDP is the wrong place to have those discussions. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have them. They are incredibly important.
Of course, the US Commerce Secretary wanted to take the G out of GDP as well.
Yeah, and then it won't balance, but which would really be a problem.
Great, thank you to all three of you. Definitely not your last opportunity to contribute, but I'd now like to open it up to Q&A from this self-selecting group of GDP fans, as we've just heard. So I suggest you raise your hands and we'll take questions. There's also the possibility for the thousands of people who are following online to enter a question on Slido, and there's a very elaborate bit of technology which is going to enable me to read out the questions from the online audience as well. So we'll have a question just directly here at the front here. Thank you.
Hello, yeah, that's working, thank you. I wanted to take up a point that Diane Coyle raised with respect to checkouts, something which concerns me. I also might refer some people to what happened in Starbucks recently, where they decided that they were going to increase the number of baristas and remove quite a lot of the technology, the idea being to improve the quality of service. The ONS spent quite a lot of time trying to measure things called quality, certainly within the scope of its public sector productivity review. There are kind of measures of quality which Starbucks must have been aware of as well, which also caused them to change the approach that they were using. And so that would get measured ultimately in Starbucks' output as well. So can you comment upon this quality question? Because I agree with you that it is a real issue, but I do also suggest that at least in some points, ONS had been trying to cope with that issue in measuring some of the productivity it tried to show us. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. There are lots of services where it's very hard to disentangle volume, price and quality. And indeed, in some of them, the price is the quality signal. So you might go to the local barbers and get a £20 haircut, or go to a Mayfair salon and pay a lot. And there's the same number of haircuts, but the price is the quality signal. And then there are others like, management consultancy, where it's really hard to understand what the volume metric is. It's not number of pages in the PowerPoint deck, is it? And new technology is fundamentally challenging their thinking about their business model because they charge for time. And if ChatGPT can do in 6 minutes what you used to bill for 6 hours, what's that going to do? So I think it varies quite a lot depending on the service that you're talking about. And some companies do have quality metrics, and others, given their market power, haven't thought about it very much at all. So I think there's a lot of research to be done there. Richard might want to comment on what ONS does.
I'll definitely comment on the Public Service Productivity Review, and I think tomorrow Catherine Kent will be chairing a session where we'll be presenting some of the work we've done there, and I know we have Ron Smith and Martin Will who'll be presenting their papers which covered the same topics. I think we could talk on that topic all afternoon, so I'll not dwell on that, but I would say do go look at the public service productivity sessions and give us your feedback, because it is an area that we're continuing to develop and think about.
And I should say, from my perspective as somebody who oversees and regulates official statistics, I think it's a really great development, the public sector productivity work, so congratulations to ONS for that. Let's go to another question. I've got a question right at the front here. If you could just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. This is a great panel. I can think of many things to say. You know, the original question about whether you thought GDP just needed tweaks, I think I voted for that, even though the word tweak was, I thought, a bit weak. But let me give you an example of why I think we need to think more expansively, even within the context of GDP as a monetary measure. I think we all agree that the digital sector of economies are important, and it's important from a business point of view, and you want to capture it in your headline measure of GDP appropriately. When, you know, the current GDP isn't just a measure of transactions, it includes some major imputations that were made many, many years ago, and we don't sort of even talk about it now. But for instance, a major portion of consumption expenditure is an imputation for owner-occupied housing. So, I mean, on that basis, I don't see why we couldn't make an imputation for the value of free digital content. I think it's a major step forward to get the prices of the paid-for digital content delivery systems quality adjusted appropriately, as the work of Diane and Richard did, and Dave and I did the same thing. David Byrne and I did the same thing for the US. But the flip side of that is it's not the whole story. The whole story includes the value of the digital content. And it's not as huge as you think. I think it's smaller in our work, at least as we estimate, it's smaller than the imputation for owner-occupied housing. And it wouldn't affect a productivity measure, because as an imputation, you would take it out before you measured, you know, productivity on a value-added basis. So it's not a hard thing to do if you would, you know, conceptually embrace it. So I think quality-adjusted prices and thinking about the production boundary as being something that should be immutable to structural change is, I think, the key thing to keep, you know, GDP as it's currently envisioned up to date. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, you mentioned imputation very briefly in your remarks. Is this something that you'd conceptually embrace?
Absolutely. I think as you say, that owner-occupied housing is large in GDP, and correctly so as an imputation. So I think a free digital content would be a very simple, not simple, but a very conceptually simple thing to add, because it's in exactly the same basis as owner-occupied housing. And I think there's quite a difference between that and a measure of the depletion of natural resources, which I think is conceptually quite different and much more difficult and contentious.
Diane?
Just to add one thing, Gary Becker's famous 1965 paper about time mentioned the importance of shifts across the production boundary for the measurement of productivity. It's one line in the paper, which hasn't been much picked up. And I think my hypothesis would be it could make quite a big difference to measured productivity when you take those into account.
For me, I think, I've done a lot of work on digital. I'm very sympathetic to this point of view. For me, it continues to be how we provide a portfolio of data which meets some different needs. So, I listen to this and my mind turns to, do you need a measure of purely market sector GVA? And then you add various imputations to it and get something called GDP. And then you have some alternative metrics that you put alongside that to say, here's how to think about some of these bigger issues that you may not want to include in GDP, but you need to consider somewhere. And I think it's working out how we tell that story in a way of set of digestible building blocks. Actually being honest about how big market GVA is. When 20% of your economy, as measured by GDP, is public services, you set a natural limit for how much this is actually red in tooth and claw market activity. Before you think about the MPIsh sector and imputed owner-occupied housing. So for me, I think you could inform the debate quite significantly by us being a little bit more clear-cut in some of those components.
My one, I think, thinking about communication to the public, I think it's hard enough. I think the public's understanding of GDP is it's some vague measure that measures progress.
Stuff, yes.
It's progress in some very vague form. No chance if you want to talk about building blocks that you'll get an audience in this room, and it's really valuable, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but I think in terms of a communication device, it's not going to work.
Thank you. Let's go towards the back of the room. There's the very furthest back hand there. Let's give the people at the back a chance.
Do you think if you didn't have such a low GDP, you wouldn't be discussing this subject? And also, if you have to change, if you want to change all that, don't you have to go to the UN to change it and ask permission from all the other countries in the world before you start fiddling around with GDP?
So the first part of that is, are we only discussing this because GDP has been so disappointing? And Diane, I'd be interested in your perspective and Chris's as well. And then Richard, you can maybe ask, don't we need to go to the UN? So Diane, do you want to take the low GDP components of the question?
I don't know. I think the fact that GDP growth has been disappointing makes it hard to switch away from it, because any politician who tries is going to be accused of only doing so because they can't deliver on the GDP. So I think it makes it hard to change. I mean, obviously, the debate about what the definition ought to be dates back at least to 2009, as Richard said, and the Sen Fitoussi-Stiglitz Commission, and actually right back to the origins of GDP. So I don't know the answer about the salience, I'm afraid.
Chris?
I don't think it is just because it's low. I think there's a natural debate in society, in the UK in particular, but obviously the US is quite different here, that we are concerned about progress because we feel we haven't had a lot of it. And I'm not sure that some of the imputations would necessarily change that view. So I don't think we're only discussing it. I actually think we're discussing it because it's an important issue that is right to discuss. In that sense, I don't think you're going to find, for Diane's reason, you're going to find politicians desperately searching for a number that makes them look better. They'll do that anyway, frankly. They're very adept at that, particularly around election times. So I think the GDP. I don't really feel that that's the key driver here.
Richard?
In terms of the UN, I think this is a point where there is a real opportunity. So the UN has a series of sustainable development goals. They reach the end of their life in around 2030. And so processes are being kicked off and being explored to identify what should succeed the sustainable development goals in the same way that they succeeded the Millennium Development Goals. So you've seen in recent weeks, the Secretary General announced a new high-level group, which is chaired by Nora Lustig, Joseph Stiglitz, Martine Durand, and a small team of experts are going to be looking at and exploring this issue in quite a lot of speed. I mean, they're meant to be reporting around December of this year. And in parallel, the UN Statistical Division has been setting up technical groups to support that work and to work out how we take it from some big conceptual ideas into practical application. So I think there is definitely an international drive in this space and an opportunity for us to seize if we have good measures and metrics which we think deserve advocation.
Great, thank you. There was a hand almost immediately in front. Yes, yeah, that hand there. No. Yep. I'm working my way down. So.
Thank you, Ed. I wanted to just come back to the 2025 SNA a bit, because there are two very big areas that are coming in the 2025 SNA. The digital economy, of course, is one of them, and Richard has done a lot of work on this. It's going to be coming, a lot of it is going to be coming within the production boundary in the national accounts under the 2025 SNA, and Eurostat and the IMF have produced a manual to show how this can be done, which of course is going to create a lot of work for ONS rising to that challenge. But that is going to become part of the core national accounts. So things are changing in that area. And the other area that is very important that is changing is natural capital, where the OECD, which I was working for until last year, has produced a manual on how to include the new measures of natural capital in the national accounts. So that's another big area. But I just wanted to conclude by saying that although we're talking about GDP today, there is also NDP, so net domestic product, which in the 2008 national accounts system of national accounts is basically GDP minus depreciation, so taking account of depreciation of machinery and equipment, for instance. And in the 2025 SNA will also take into account depletion of natural capital. So this is in fact very interesting, I think, because there is going to be a measure that includes some element of environmental sustainability and is going to show to what extent NDP, if you like, of a country is reflecting the whether the country is sustainable in terms of its use of natural resources or is in fact relying very heavily on exploitation of fossil fuels. So those are two big areas in the 2025 SNA where things are changing, and there's a lot of work to be done, and it's going to be a big challenge for ONS, but I think it's going to improve. So if we don't just think about GDP but about NDP as well, I think we can get some interesting measures in the future.
Richard, I'm going to come to you in a second on that, because a lot of that was in your territory, but just come to you first, Chris. You were rather sceptical about the value of including depletion of natural resources. Having heard that articulation of NDP, do you think that NDP might have a place?
Well, I think we as society do at least discuss an NDP type concept. We never discuss NDP, but we do say, oh, the roads are crumbling, our schools are falling apart, nothing works anymore. That is literally taking depreciation into account. So again, I'll go back to what I said. I do think society is quite good at getting hold of these concepts. We do talk about degradation of the environment all the time, and we're pretty good at talking about these things. So I think you don't have to necessarily, I don't say you shouldn't add them and there should never be a measure of these things. Absolutely, they're very important, but I think in terms of headline measures for economic progress, GDP is pretty, on a very broad sense, don't go down to decimal points, reasonable, and we're quite good at talking about these other subjects, but not in a national accounts framework.
Thank you. Richard?
I'm probably going to focus a little bit on the natural capital point that Sarah raised. And I think this is for me an area that we've got to do a bit of exploration and to really prove the value, where oddly I think I'm probably a little bit closer to Chris than maybe he would assume. National accounts works in market prices. The problem with environmental assets is they bring externalities that are not reflected in their market price. If you bring something into an accounting system and you give it a very low valuation, you are saying it's not very important. And I'm not sure that's the message that we want to give policymakers about the value of natural capital. I think we have to do some very, we have to think very deeply and research properly the right way to conceptualize natural capital in the accounts and the externality implications of that. That's a wonderfully techie answer, which thankfully I'm in this room and not attempting to explain this anywhere else. But there's, Diane and Julia at the ESCoE are doing lots of work on alternative models of shadow prices and these types of things. And for me, before we just put the natural resources in, I think we need to think very carefully about the message that comes out, and that does reflect the value that we recognise that those types of assets have.
Thank you. Can I just see the full show of hands? I'll just work out how to manage the remaining few minutes. So we've got a question here, and then a cluster of questions here. I think what we'll do is we'll take a cluster of questions, if that's okay, just to make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask their question. Are there any questions online? No questions online. Okay, great. So a question immediately, a couple of rows in front of you, and then we'll sweep down to this part of the room.
Martin Wheel, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. No one has said anything about the distribution of resources. Do you think that those countries that are increasingly attributing GDP, including the non-distributed components, to households are going a bit too far? Or do you think that that's going to be an important feature of GDP in the future? It does, of course, mean it's possible to produce indicators that differ slightly from conventional GDP in a reasonably straightforward way. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was a hand down here, so we'll come down here.
Thank you. I just want to resist the idea that it is people with particular political views that win the environment. In GDP, people are affected by natural disasters all the time, like the floods in Valencia last year, droughts in Greece, etc., etc. So I think the idea that it's up to one's political views, whether these are sort of fundamental measurement to include in measurements of the economy, is probably not enough. And if we should accept that as statisticians, we should hold our horses in including these in headline measures. I mean, some people's if it's up to people's political sentiment, some people's political sentiment is to not care about facts. So why are we talking about GDP at all? But more importantly, if I understand correctly, the argument against including these measures is that GDP is not the right place to debate these issues. And I want to say that I guess there's a lot of, this is happening already in GDP. When you're producing GDP, you are actually having a lot of these debates right now. And I think this is part of the point Diane's making about GDP failing on its own terms. You still have to make calls about what is sensible, what is statistical error, what's investment versus intermediate consumption, what's quality improvement versus price. To give an extreme example, when slavery was abolished, a big chunk of wealth in this country vanished overnight, right? So I would argue that there are debates happening in GDP about things we care about every day, already these kinds of debates. So to say that GDP is not the right place to have these debates is not enough, I guess.
Okay, so I think the first question about distribution, I think you could all take, and I think the second question probably is more for you, Chris. But Richard, on the distributional issues.
Yeah. I think there's no doubt that distributions are important. I think probably at the moment, the key question that the ONS is grappling with is around where to put its resources and which priorities to address first. And that, I think, is an important debate. It's ongoing at the moment. And obviously, producing lots of new measures. A lot of what we're talking about here is producing new material. But a lot of what we talk about actually takes a relatively small number of people. The teams we have working on this are not extensive. But some of those more big data intensive pieces like distributional work, obviously we have to think about how we...
Just to come in, the question which the tech has delivered to me from the online audience, anonymous asks a question which is very pertinent to that. But you might feel you've already answered this. Shouldn't the ONS focus on better measuring the current concepts before thinking about changing those concepts? Lots of issues in current national accounts data. You might feel you've already covered that in terms of the bandwidth and the stretch, but is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Probably the only thing I'd add is because the SNA has been revised and we want to maintain international comparability of data, a lot of the things that we've been talking about over the last hour or so, data as an asset, natural capital, these are things that we will have to introduce to maintain that international consistency. But the international community will need to move on those things together. It's looking likely that will be more like 2029, 2030, 2031, which gives us time to focus on what we need to do with the current data estate as well.
Distributional issues?
Super important, but the most political statistic has been price indices, actually, historically. That's where all of the energy has gone. And at a time like the recent inflationary period, you can't substitute your free TikTok videos for the food and energy. So thinking about how we measure prices seems to me the top priority.
Great. And it's all political at the end of the day, Chris?
On your online message, I think the answer is yes, very quickly. On distribution, it's very important. We struggle to do distribution just in all parts. We know how important it is, and we just need to do it better. And you only have to look at the US debate about income and wealth distribution and different sources of data on that to know how difficult it is. And in terms of the environment and whether we should include them, and your challenge to me, I would give you a challenge directly back, which is, let's take the floods in Valencia. That got global news coverage. That got more political salience in Spain and globally for the environment than I can guarantee a Spanish GDP figure with natural capital would ever get. So, we are very good at looking at disasters around the world, reacting to them, and then thinking about public policy. And we don't need, GDP is not going to be the mechanism to make us think harder about that.
Let's just have one last round. We've got 3 questions. Let's do them very quickly. Joe Grice in the middle here, and then a couple of rows back, and then about 4 rows back. So if you could, a succinct question, if you don't mind, Joe.
I sometimes feel a sense of world weariness about this debate because it sort of goes on for decade after decade, and yet actually you then see that GDP appears once a month and dominates the news agenda for the day. So I really wonder whether cataloguing the failings of GDP is actually getting us very far over time. For that reason, I sort of feel my sympathy with what Chris said on the whole, but with one exception, and that is GDP is not understood, as you said, Chris, and it's become a sort of measure of national reality. Are we doing well? Are we doing not? How do we stop it becoming just this kind of measure, a bit like Harold Wilson's balance of payment statistics? How do we stop it becoming seen as this measure of national success? And specifically, taking up Sarah's point, if the SNA tells us we should all concentrate on net measures, what does ONS do if the punters then say, no, we'll stick with the GDP, thank you very much?
Thanks. Just a couple of rows back there.
Sanjay Mahajan from the Office for National Statistics. I'll have to declare my interest here. I was one of the 5 supporting editors of the 2025 SNA. Might give you a clue where I'm coming from. However, I'll be first to say that I agree and disagree with Richard, I agree and disagree with Diane, and I agree and disagree with Chris. There's merits of a lot of the arguments being presented. But what my fear is there's a degree of conflation, and I'm not going to go into all of the items, but just a couple for a sake. We have a conceptual framework. It's the National Accounts Framework. GDP is just one indicator that comes out of that framework. There are many other indicators like real household disposable income, etc. You look at the balance sheets, you get a lot of information that can support whatever argument you're considering at that point in time. So the concepts are fine, The measurement is really challenging. Measuring some of these things is not easy. And then I think what happens is people lose sight that the measurement is a challenge, therefore the concept's wrong. No, they're getting it, the tail's wagging the dog. It's the other way around. So I just want to quickly say, factoryless goods processors, concepts are clear. Measurement is a challenge. Gross value added in terms of trading value added in global value chains, concepts are clear. Measurement's a challenge. Spot the theme. I'm a bit concerned about this old dialogue about freebies. Nothing is free. Someone somewhere along the chain pays for it. So if we get into quantifying freebies, we've got a different concept of consumer surplus, and we need to think about that. So finally, it's in a sense, we need sound, proven, tested methods with the ability to measure to support our concepts. And in the 2025 SNA, and I think I don't want to repeat what Sarah said, we have gone a long way. It may not be enough for some.
Can you wrap up so we have time for that? Thank you. And there's a question three or four rows back, and we'll take that question. Then I'll allow you, the three of you, to roam across those three final, which are actually amongst the most challenging questions we've had. So they're very good. So go ahead, please.
Thank you. It sort of touches on some of the similar points Joe raised. It's sort of, I think most of this discussion raises the fact that we don't just want one number that captures some or all of this. So it's actually about the point that Chris made. There's a debate to be had about the various values and priorities that we put to this. So it's more about actually how do we get more prominence to those other aspects that may matter for some people more than others, the environment, society, inequalities. And then slightly relatedly, is it actually a question of calculation or are there genuine data gaps?
Great, thank you. Richard, any final remarks based on those comments or anything else that you want to say?
Yes, I think on Sanjeev's little dichotomy there, the concepts are fine and the measurements are a challenge. The measures are a challenge. I think some of the things outside the world of national accounts, probably we'd better say the concepts are partial. There's some things that still we need to do more work on outside those things which the SNA covered. But the measurement challenge, I think, yes, that definition of needing tested methods, we've run satellite accounts for a large number of years. We've run them against the manuals and the guidance, and we've got to start trusting and using that data. And that's what we've tried to do with inclusive income and wealth accounts. We've taken satellite accounts we've run for years, but when you ask the question, why do we do these satellite accounts? Unless we put them somewhere and use that data, we're just wasting statistician time. And I think that is the part that we are now starting to really explore and see the benefit of those.
Diane.
I think some of the issues are, it's really hard to do the measurement, but I think there are real conceptual issues as well. I'd go back particularly to price indices and also the concept of productivity. I think there are real conceptual challenges. I've got a lot of sympathy of the idea that it's horses for courses, that you might need different measures for different purposes, and the spectrum that Richard talked about is part of the answer there. But the communication is really difficult, but luckily that's Chris's job.
And Chris, perfect.
So Joe, I am, and the last, how do we get more prominence to sort of treating it in a holistic sense, particularly the national accounts. A really, really flippant answer would be to read the Financial Times and not watch the BBC. But that's far too flippant because I understand how few people read the FT rather than getting news from broadcasters or other news organisations. I'm not entirely convinced that the public are hanging on quarterly GDP figures as much as you think they are. It will lead the bulletins very briefly in the mornings, and it will be a news in brief by the evening because it's really not very interesting. I think the US Q1 GDP figure, and you don't want to hear the internal debate we had in the FT, and I had to sit by the news desk trying to hold their hands on, did it do import subtract from GDP? The language around that, it was all very difficult. But so the headline measures are often really, really useless, and we certainly don't want to have society think that is the be all and end all of how to measure society's progress. And so I'm fully sympathetic. How do we stop us doing that? I think in the end, it's, if you're thinking about from a statistical agency point of view, it is to just do the hard work of explaining to the intermediaries, us lot, what is right and wrong, and particularly going back and saying, maybe going through some of the copy and saying, you know, that was a bad interpretation, because actually journalists generally, not always, generally would like to do things better, but also the way it's described has to be better. It means that maybe the ONS should, in the UK context, and I'll say this because I'm not be so desperate to release statistics at 7 o'clock so they can get on the Today programme, which does seem to be the main reason that time is used, and maybe thinking hard about how the ONS itself describes the headlines at the top of the press releases, because that is obviously going to be influential.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to all three of you. In contrast to one of the questioners, I don't come to this any world weariness. I thought it was a really riveting and energising and fascinating discussion. So thank you to all three of you. Thank you indeed to all of you in the audience who have asked so many good, challenging, wide-ranging questions. Fantastic. And I think we're all agreed that we don't like the Robert F. Kennedy quote. So thank you, and have a good day. Thank you.